approximations don't. For the kind of relevant parametric examples, the relevant calibrations, we solve these things using very kind of computer-intensive numerical methods, very fine discrete grids on the level and volatility, and just doing value function iterations to solve the model. You're not going to know what these pictures are, but the exact solution is the blue line. The dashed line is a log-linear approximation. The dashed pink line, and what you're going to see is like there's absolutely no separation between these two things. The upper panel is for stochastic volatility. The lower panel is for the stochastic jump intensity model. And so log-linear approximations, there's no issue that these results could be generated by approximation here. The approximations are extremely precise. That's not true for all calibrations, but for the ones that we're interested in, they're virtually identical. Okay, we also think about the Campbell-Cochrane version of the difference habit model, where they introduce this state-dependent habit sensitivity process, lambda. And to make the model work, lambda's got to have some special features, not an arbitrary function. It's a function that's rigged in a particular way. We're going to say it's a function that's rigged in a particular way to exactly control for horizon dependence without destroying the entropy. And we'll see that very clearly in a second. But it's a kind of different way, a different approach to getting some stochastic volatility, some stochastic scale into the shock process. So here's a summary of all the models we looked at. The top panel looks at entropy. The lower panel looks at horizon dependence. So we want entropy to be big. We want it to be 1% per month, this dashed line, or bigger. Horizon dependence, we want it to be small. If you think the yield curve is upward sloping, then we want horizon dependence to be near this dashed line. If you're happy with the yield curve, this is the real yield curve, downward sloping, it's fine. It can slope down, it has to slope down just a little bit. So there's a bound below here. And a whole litany of models. There's a Vasicek model that we fit lots of entropy, and we nail horizon dependence just right. That's totally rigged in a reduced form sense. Now the question is, how do the structural models fit? Well, we saw power utility is really bad at making this trade-off. He's unable to make this trade-off between entropy and horizon dependence that the data are calling for. Recursive utility with constant volatility, we can't find parameters that do that. The previous picture I put up, we can tweak parameters, and we can in fact get lots of entropy, and we can kind of get horizon dependence. There's no freedom to do that. Ratio habits don't work. Difference habits don't work. Recursive utility with stochastic volatility.
Why would that?
What's that?
Why would the difference habits not?
Oh, you can't get. It's different. You can't get enough horizon dependence to get a sense of the yield curve habit. It's just. We can go back and look at the equation if you like. But so we call these bounds. It's bad. These are more kind of targets. Yeah, calling this a bound is bad language. If you recall that, we would like horizon dependence to be that number, to fit the yield curve. So if the average yield curve is met with noise, is estimated with noise, we would like horizon dependence to be kind of in the neighborhood of this, and difference happens doesn't come close. If you're just plotting yield curves for this rapid horizon dependence, you would see that it doesn't look like big at all. Recursive utility with stochastic volatility seems to work really well. There's lots of scope in tweaking parameters to these different trade-offs. The Campbell-Cochrane model, you'll see, has absolutely no horizon dependence, but substantial entropy. And it's totally rigged to do that. This habit sensitivity process was completely rigged to have a constant interest rate and a flat yield curve. There's a question if you loosen up those restrictions, you look at a slightly different habit sensitivity process, what this trade-off will look like. We haven't done that. can see that that model does have capacity for separating into two dimensions. The stochastic intensity model is tricky to work with. The Factor model is tricky to work with. It's kind of a mess. It's a really interesting parameterization of a disaster jump process. But Amir's bazooka keeps blowing out. So you can get amazing amounts of entropy out of this model. But it's really hard to kind of target horizon events. Really tiny changes in parameters create huge differences in dynamics. So it's a bit unstable in a typical parameterization. But we also look at a constant intensity. Rather than having the intensity process follow some dynamics, just make it a constant parameter. And Amir's bazooka is much more containable in that case, much more, it's easier to aim in that case. And sometimes you can see, though, that even with constant intensity, there's lots of separation between these two things. But this exponential function in the pricing curve plays a really, really big role. It's very, very fragile in parameter space. Okay. So what did we learn from all this? Well, we think that we have a tool that's especially in the long linear types of models that people in macrofinance work with. A model for evaluating structural models on dimensions that we think are quantitatively relevant. Excess return suggests that entropy needs to be big, but horizon dependence needs to be small. Most models that people work with have a lot of tension between those two features. When we think about models that are likely to be sensible, useful structural models, we only look for separation of those two dimensions. Models that have parameters that have different horizon dependence than they do in entropy. We also we're convinced that a lot of these models are normal one step ahead, but over multiple horizons, they're not normal, right? These passive volatilities or jump intensity models, over longer horizons, they're anything but normal. They're non-linear shocks over multiple horizons, so they're not Gaussian. We think that's an important feature of these models. What's next? A whole bunch of stuff. One thing that we kind of played down in this paper, but I think it's really important, is the difference between real and nominal shocks. The data we don't have very clean data on the real yield curve, or very clean data on real rates of return over multiple horizons, or real option payouts. The models we work with are all real models, right? There's no inflation component. You could simply add in some exogenous inflation process and tweak that and see how that is affected, how that affects these measures of entropy and horizon dependence. Rather, what we do instead, there's people coming up today that I'm interested in, is thinking about inflation as an endogenous process. And in particular, modern monetary policy, the Taylor rule, delivers exactly that. It delivers monetary policy, it delivers inflation that loads up on real factors endogenously. Hence, it'll have somewhat more restricted, but perhaps easier to interpret entropy and horizon dependence than just a model where we're stuck in some exogenous inflation. So that's a drawing board as well. I didn't spend any time in this talk doing a literature review. Literature reviews tend to be like negative value real options. We put a bunch of names up there, and if your name is up there, you don't really care. But if your name is not up there, you're really angry. So it's nothing to negative value is. So I'll have to leave it at the end. So again, there's lots of people who work on these patterns. Albrecht Jordan, Van Salomon, Hansen Jagan, Hansen Schenker. Lots of people work with recursive utility models and instant pricing. Lots of people with Hack's models. And there's really a big and growing literature on disasters and tail risk. There's really interesting. So there's lots of stuff to read and lots of work to do if you're interested. Okay. Thank you very much. I am out of slides. So I guess I'm Wow. So, excellent question. So if we go back here, recursive utility has a lot of flexibility and in a time consistent, we were talking about time consistency yesterday, for dynamic asset pricing models, if not for it's kind of micro experimental methods. Dynamic asset pricing models, we would like to build in stationarity and time consistency. So within this recursive framework, we can have lots of non-expected utility-like behavior, build in lots of behavioral features, but still respect the stationarity and homogeneity that are so useful in looking at aggregate outcomes. So in this exercise, we just left the certain equivalent as an expected utility certain equivalent. Certain equivalent over next period's continuation utility. But there's no reason to do that. If you like disappointment aversion, make this a disappointment aversion certain equivalent, and you can do the analysis with that. If you like the generalized disappointment aversion that focuses more on tail outcomes, that goes in very nicely here. And what you will get, and there are people that have built in kind of prospect theory into this model, or all kinds of interesting things. It all loads in this stationary, time-consistent model, all loads in a certain equivalent, and then the analysis falls from there. What's going to happen? Yes? Sure. You can't just start at day zero and write down prospect theory for a sequence of consumption. But if you build prospect theory in recursively, so the prospects you're worried about are these continuation utility prospects. And so it's this certain equivalent operation that can come from a prospect theory like story. And can be, you want to satisfy, first order stochastic comments and continuity and transitivity. But that's fine, those are parametric restrictions. You can do that. But building it in recursively by having applying prospect theory to continuation utilities rather than individual consumptions, you will in fact get time consistency. If you put prospect theory on a sequence of consumptions directly, you won't have time consistency. But done recursively, by construction, you will. And that's relatively easy to do. So the answer to that, the further answer to your question is, when we get down to this point, to the pricing kernel, there'll be extra moments, or the pricing of moments, in terms of pricing of skewness, will appear in this equation differently for disappointment aversion, general disappointment aversion, or maybe these preferences are lower on the table test. That's really interesting. I haven't done that in this paper. But in particular, I think if you go back and want to understand what's really wild asset returns you get from out of the money options or straddles and things like that, you're going to need something that, you're going to need preferences that do something very different to tail events. It's not just jumps. It's going to be jumps and some preference that really loads on jumps. And I think this point version, general point version, play a big role in understanding that. But nonetheless, we can nest all that in this entropy velocity kind of framework in a straightforward way. Sure. If we start with the Markov P measure, and we use, we have time invariant parameters that take it to Q measure, and Q measure will also be Markov. If you start with a non-Markovian P measure, then this will likely just translate. I can be covered. Let me back up. The solution to most of these models is predicated on having a stationary Markov environment. We're outside of the stationary Markov environment. I'm not quite sure how to solve these models. It's the same, it's important that it's the same function of the state variables on the right-hand side as on the left-hand side in this fixed point. In a non-Markovian world, that's not going to be true. I'm not very sure I think about that. But it could be interesting, but I don't have an answer. Okay, what's the comment?